Good evening. On behalf of the Newark Public Library, welcome to tonight's program, 19th Century Newark Photographers. I'm Tom Ankner, Director of the Charles F. Cummings New Jersey Information Center at the Newark Public Library. Tonight, we are excited to feature this talk by archivist, historian, and photographer Gary D. Saretzky. Gary has written extensively about the history of New Jersey photographers. Tonight, as the title of his talk suggests, he will focus on 19th century photographers who worked in Newark. We ask that everyone keep their cameras and microphones off during Gary's presentation. Please type any questions or comments in the chat box. Gary will get to as many as possible after his talk. Now for some background on tonight's speaker. I first met Gary Saretzky when he was the Monmouth County Archivist, a job he held for more than 20 years before retiring in 2019. In addition to his work as an archivist, Gary is a historian and photographer. He has a Bachelor of Arts and a Master's in American History from the University of Wisconsin in Madison. He also studied photo conservation at Rochester Institute of Technology and the New York State Historical Association. He has been an educational consultant at the Thomas Edison College in Princeton and an instructor at the Mercer County Community College. Before he became the Monmouth County Archivist, he was an archivist at the Educational Testing Service. He has also been a self-employed photographer since 1975. It is my pleasure to introduce Gary D. Saretzky. Gary.
Thank you, Tom. I'm very happy to be here. Welcome, audience. Thank you very much for attending this talk. As you can see by the title, we're going to talk about, or I'm going to talk about 19th century New Jersey photographers. I'd like to dedicate this talk to Charles Cummings, who the history room at the Newark Public Library is named after. And the reason is that Charles and another fellow named John O'Connor started a list of New Jersey photographers of the 19th century several decades ago. And I continued that effort and now have more than 3,000 that I've found. And they're on my webpage, Saretzky.com. So today we're just going to talk about some of the ones from Newark. And there were hundreds that were in Newark. And we're only going to be able to talk about a small sample of them. But I hope you'll find this of interest. Photography really begins in 1839 with the introduction of the Daguerreotype in France, and it quickly came to the United States. And at that time, Newark was just beginning to be a really bustling center for manufacturing, and it was starting to grow. These are some images of Newark in the 1840s, right around the time when the Daguerreotype was introduced, and local people started going to Daguerreotype studios, mostly on Broad Street, to have their picture taken. Here's a view of Broad Street from 1854. It doesn't actually show any Daguerrean studios, but they would have been among these shops that you see along the street. And here, looking north along Broad Street as well. So try to imagine that you're back around this time and you would go into one of these galleries and have your Daguerreotype made. The number of photographers in New Jersey was relatively small compared to New York, as you can see from this brief statistical summary from 1870. New Jersey was largely an agricultural state, the garden state. There were cities, but they were not anywhere near as large as New York or Philadelphia. And so there were correspondingly fewer photographers, as you can see by this slide. If we look at 1885 in Newark, one of the striking statistics is the number of people from Germany who were in Newark in 1885. Just in almost 20% of the men were born in Germany, and that doesn't include people who were children of one or two German immigrants. Towards the end of the century, we start to see people from other parts of Europe emigrating to Newark, and that changes the ethnic composition of the state and of Newark. The largest cities in 1890s were Newark and Jersey City. And so there was more photographers in those places than there were in these other towns. And notice that after the first few here on the list, all the other places in New Jersey had fewer than 20,000 people. And on average, a photographer needed about 7,000 people to make a living in a town. So if you have a town with 7,000, usually there's only one photographer there. So in Newark, up to 1900, I've found about 500 photographers. More than 400 of them were professionals, and about 68 were members of the Newark Camera Club, which I'll come to again a little bit later. It started in the 1880s. And almost all of these professional photographers and all the amateur photographers I found were men. There were women photographers in Newark as well as elsewhere in New Jersey, but they were in the minority. And I'll be talking about one of them a little bit later. Here's an indication of how much of the business of photography was concentrated in Newark. If we look at these 1867 tax returns, which I compiled at the National Archives, you can see that the top photographer in the state in terms of gross income was Joseph Kirk. We'll look at him a little bit more later. And then after Ira Owen and Newton, then you have Stoutenberg and Logan and Moffat, who were both in Newark. And then going further down, you see DeCamp and Crane, Kennedy and Schenck, Royal Hill Rose, who was for a time partners with Stoutenberg, and Emil Spahn. We'll talk about him a little bit later. And down near the bottom there is Huff, who we'll also talk about, even though his gross in 1867 was quite small. That's because he was just starting and he was only in business for 3 months in that year. So I mentioned that most of these photographers were on Broad Street. And just in this year, 1874, this is just some of the photographers who were on there. And I'll tell you a little bit more about some of these later, but I just wanted to give you, float these names across you just so you get a little familiar with some of the names here. Huff and Kirk, I already mentioned. Charles Parker, I'm not going to go into, but I will mention him briefly a little bit later. Stillman Rand, J. Henry Smith. And these photographers, most of them were in business for a fair amount of time, the ones that I've mentioned here. And in 1874, only 3 of the photographers listed in the Newark Business Directory were not on Broad Street. So Broad Street really was the concentration. You can see even in the 700 block, there were several right on that one street. So now let's look at some of the Newark photographers in a little more detail. This talk is divided into 2 sections from this point on. I'm going to go into a fair amount of detail about these selected photographers, and then I'm going to go briefly over a number of the other ones, just so you have some feeling for who some of the other figures in the history of photography in Newark were. So before we go to the first photographer, let's talk a little bit about the technology and what kind of pictures these folks were making. I mentioned Daguerre introduced the Daguerreotype in 1839. Here you see him 10 years later. And the Daguerreotype was a one-of-a-kind picture. It was on a copper plate. There was no negative. The plate had a shiny mirror surface. It was silvered and then polished. And then it was sensitized with fumes of iodine, which formed silver iodide, light-sensitive chemical on the surface. Other fuming could also take place and was added later, but in the original process, it was just iodine. And then it would be put into the camera. And after an exposure, initially would take 1 to 3 minutes. Then it was brought down with these additional fuming steps, but initially it took about 1 to 3 minutes to get a picture. And then it would still be invisible in the plate would not show an image. The plate would be taken out of the camera and then put into another fuming box where it would be exposed to fumes of mercury, and that would make the picture visible. Then that image then had to be fixed so it wouldn't be sensitive to light anymore, and then washed, and then it could be put into a case to protect it because the surface was very, very delicate. So here's an example of a daguerreotype, this one by the firm of Rolfe and Jenks in Newark from the middle 1850s. And here you can see what was a typical kind of a case. What you don't see is the glass that's covering the brass mat around the image, because the glass, is invisible in the slide. But daguerreotypes are one of a kind, unless you made a daguerreotype of a daguerreotype or some other kind of a copy later. So the first daguerreotype in Newark was made by Seth Boyden, a figure whom you may be familiar with as an inventor in Newark. He was a well-known mechanic. He had a workshop in what is now Washington Park. And he built his own camera, and that camera is at the Newark Museum. It's a really unique camera. He created a camera in which the daguerreotype plate is face down at the top of this stack of boxes. When you open the doors at the bottom, that lets in the light, and then there's a mirror inside the lower box that reflects the light up to the daguerreotype plate that's face down at the top of the box. And one advantage of this system is that it reversed the image from left to right, just like a mirror does, because most daguerreotypes are backwards. They're mirror images of what was in front of the camera, but Boyden's was not. Boyden's, it was right reading. It would, if you took a picture of a building with a sign, it would come out looking, you could read the sign, normally. Very unusual and unique camera. And in the Sentinel of Freedom in 1840, there's a newspaper reference that he's been taking some pictures. It says, we had the pleasure yesterday of examining several specimens of these pictures. And unfortunately, we have not found any of these pictures today. Hopefully they will turn up someday. Boyden is also well known for his other, he's more well known really for his other contributions, including malleable iron and Japan leather. Some of his work dealt with improving the functioning of locomotives. And he was recognized by a statue in 1890, which is in Washington Park in front of the, right near the Newark Public Library and in front of the museum. And there was a big celebration when they unveiled the statue. As you can see, there's many people came to that event. And there's an inscription on the statue that said that he took the first photographs in America, which is not true. He probably took the first in New Jersey, but he was probably preceded by a couple of people in New York and Philadelphia. But that's the statue. So another very early maker of daguerreotypes was James Ackerman, who in August of 1841 was at Mechanics Hall on the corner of Broad and William Street. And he apparently was taking daguerreotypes there for a few months. His ad said that he had come from Philadelphia, but I could not find any trace of him there. I'm not saying he was a liar, but I just wasn't able to find any mention of him in any newspapers there. In the Somerset Whig of June 1841, as you see here, he said that he would be making daguerreotype portraits for 5 days only for $3 a piece, which is over $100 today. And exposures vary from 1 to 3 minutes, indicating that he was using a very early version of the daguerreotype process before it had been made more sensitive to light through the additional fuming steps that I mentioned briefly earlier. The daguerreotype was really astonishing to people at the time. Nobody had even seen anything like it. And the detail was incredible. And it says the individual has to sit only for 3 minutes, and in less than half an hour, you'll get a perfect likeness. And whereas before you would sit for a painting or a drawing, and it would take hours and hours. And then it says nothing is wanted but colors. And it was a monochrome process, although some daguerreotypists were able to introduce a little bit of color by the way in which they exposed it. Sometimes you get blue skies with a daguerreotype, but for portrait, usually it just came out monochromatic. And then sometimes they would add color by hand. Another early figure in Newark was Ebenezer Larwell, who is among those who contributed to the development of photography in Newark through manufacturing rather than as a photographer, although he did also make photographs. He was from England, and his profession really was making pocketbooks, but he invented a new type of daguerreotype case, the double door daguerreotype case. He went into business as a case manufacturer by 1849, and you'll see an example shortly of the labels that he had. I'll show you an example of a daguerreotype made by Larwell. This is not a double door one. This is the standard case in which the hinge is on the left-hand side of the image, and then the cover comes over to the right. Here's the label from that particular one, and it mentions that he applied for a patent, but doing a patent search, I couldn't find that he ever got one. Whereas this is the double door Larwell case, in which two half doors open in the center. And these are quite interesting cases. That's the back of the case, which looks like a typical daguerreotype case. But the only difference is that the fasteners are in the top and the bottom. They're like little hooks that keep it closed. Whereas in a standard case, it would be on one side or the other. And here is the double door case opened. So Larwell, after a few years, he went into the grocery business, and then he started making pocketbooks again. And he died at the age of 79 of typhoid and malaria. So the daguerreotype process, the heyday really was the 1840s and early 1850s. In 1850, a new process was introduced, which gradually superseded the daguerreotype by the Civil War. By 1860, there were few daguerreotypes made after that. Collodion is a clear, sticky liquid, and it sticks very nicely to glass. And so you could coat glass with collodion, sensitize it to light with a silver solution, and then put it in the camera to make glass plate negatives. And then you could make multiple prints from those negatives. And usually they would do that in the sun. And they would sensitize paper that had been coated with egg white, called albumin paper. And then after that dried, then they could put the negative on top of it, expose it to the sun, and then they would get positive prints. And you could do this over and over again and get as many prints as you wanted, whereas daguerreotypes were one of a kind. You could also use collodion to make ambrotypes, which were very lightly exposed glass plate negatives. And then with some sort of a dark backing, they would actually look positive. So it was a one-step process. It kind of looked like a daguerreotype with not quite as much contrast, but they still could come out very nice. And it was a cheap knockoff of the daguerreotype because glass was much cheaper than copper. And then the third application of collodion was ferrotypes, which were on iron. They got the name tintypes later, but tintypes is really a misnomer because they're not on tin, they're on iron, and they will attract a magnet. And for a tintype, you start out with an iron plate, you coat it with black paint or a black lacquer, and that we'll come back to that a little bit later. Those were manufactured that way, and then the photographer would then sensitize them like they would sensitize for an ambrotype or glass plate negative before putting it in the camera. And the camera, the plates for all three of these applications, they had to still be damp from the sensitizing solution, when they were exposed in the camera. So this all became known as the wet plate process. So from the glass plate negatives, they would then make these albumin prints, and they continued to be popular until about 1890, the albumin prints. Even up to 1900, some photographers still were making them. And the professionals would use certain standard sizes, and they would buy cardboard that often had their name printed on it, and they would mount the photos to these cards. So the carte de visite, or CDV for short, was a very, very popular size in the 1860s and 70s. And then it was gradually superseded by the cabinet card, which heyday was the 1880s and 1890s. Those were mostly used for portraits, but sometimes for other outdoor work as well. And then stereographs of two images side by side that would look 3D in a stereo viewer. They were another very popular size. And there were many other sizes. Boudoir I mentioned here, but there was also Victoria size panel, and many others that never got as much popularity as the carte de visite. This is just an example of one. This is by Orrin C. Benjamin, who's one of the photographers I'll tell you about in more detail later. This is from the early 1860s. Here's another one by Benjamin. And here's an example of a stereograph. This is by G.C. Robinson and Company of Newark, showing the corner of West Broad and Bank Streets in the early 1870s. This is the back of that card. And it's interesting how much information sometimes the backs of these views have. Sometimes they'll have a list of views that are available for sale. This one gives some introduction about the business, saying these new rooms, in other words, they've just opened for business at this point. And this is a cabinet card. This subject is a little bit unusual. A guy tickling another guy with a fake spider in the 1880s from a Newark studio that I'm not going to go into. And then here's an example of a tintype. I don't know that this one is from Newark. I don't know where it was made. But this young lady is sitting on a photographer's posing chair. You can see the fringes on the arm there that she's leaning against. And that arm was adjustable, so it could go to the side, so you could put your elbow on it, or even in the front. And the photographic suppliers, the largest of which in this era was the E&HT Anthony Company of New York, they would sell the photographers just about anything they would need, from cameras to studio accessories, including chairs. And you see on the lower left there, a chair that looks very much like the picture in the tintype I just showed you. So I mentioned, since we're talking about tintypes, Newark became a center for tintype plate manufacturing. Horace Hedden and his son Horace M. Hedden opened up a factory in Newark in 1861, where they made what they called Phoenix plates. And Phoenix was spelled a couple of different ways. There earlier had been another factory in Newark by a guy named White, who made Daguerreotype plates that he called Phoenix plates. They merged in 1863 with a firm in Worcester, Mass, Dean Emerson. And then they continued manufacturing these plates both in Newark and in Massachusetts. And then in 1869, they introduced the first real innovation in tintype plates since the 1850s, and that was the chocolate plate, which came in 3 shades of brown. Previously, they were all a neutral, black and white tone. So photographers now had a choice of plates that they hadn't had before. And as you can see in 1870 here, they had produced $4,500 worth of plates in Newark with 4 employees, 2 men and 2 women. And they supplied the major distributors like Anthony in New York with these tintype plates that were iron plates. They were very nicely finished. And on one side, they were coated with what was called Japan black. It was a black varnish or a slightly brownish varnish. And then the photographers, as I mentioned earlier, they would sensitize them just before use. Horace Hedden Jr., the Horace M. and Hedden, he continued manufacturing these plates until the 20th century. Here's an example of a chocolate tintype. You can see it's got a brownish tone. And here's an ad for a ferrotype mat. This is when you would take a tintype and put it into a paper mat that's the same size as a carte de visite. So it would fit into a family album that was made for carte de visite sized photographs. And so the photographers would sell them with these paper mats. So this is actually an ad for the mat. And Collins, A.M. Collins and Son of Philadelphia, they were the major manufacturers of cardstock and mats for photographers, I think in the United States, certainly, you know, in the region. And this is an ad for that. And they're talking here about the, you know, for the chocolate, the Phoenix chocolate tinted plate. And here's an example of one of those plates. This is actually from a handbook for photographers by Edward M. Estabrook, who wrote a book called The Ferrotype and How to Make It, which had actual tintypes pasted into the book. They were bound into the book so you could really see what these things are supposed to look like. Estabrook had tintype studios in New York and Brooklyn, and briefly in New Jersey as well. Now, another innovator from Newark, who was the subject of a recent excellent talk by Gordon Bond, who's writing a book on this fellow, Hannibal Goodwin. He's a major figure in the next technological revolution, which was the change from collodion wet plate photography to film. So around 1880, collodion glass plate negatives were replaced with gelatin dry plate negatives. They were coated with gelatin instead of collodion, and they didn't have to be used while still damp, and the photographers would buy them ready to use. They were sensitized in the factory. So photographers very quickly switched to gelatin, but they still had glass plates. And so in order to have roll film that could be used in cameras to take multiple pictures or to make movies with, which was not feasible with glass plates, you needed to have a flexible support for the gelatin emulsion. So Hannibal Goodwin filed for a patent in 1887. He was the rector of a house of prayer, the House of Prayer in Newark, and he is considered to be the earliest inventor of flexible film. And this is the house where he lived. I understand it's the second oldest house in Newark that's still standing. And he worked in the attic on this. And it took a long time for him to get his patent approved. Meanwhile, George Eastman started manufacturing it based on his own patents. And then there was a big lawsuit. Goodwin died 14 years later. Eastman and Goodwin's successors settled for millions of dollars in Goodwin's favor. This is a sign outside Goodwin's, the rectory there. And it mentions that he invented the sensitive film, marking a great advance in the art of photography. So right in Newark, this is a very important person who really had an influence on photography worldwide. This is the medal given by the Ansco Company, which Goodwin's wife sold the rights to of the patent. Ansco was a merger of the Anthony and Scoville camera companies. And here's an ad for an early Kodak, which employed roll film. And this really increased the amount of amateur photography So this really revolutionized, roll film really revolutionized photography, especially making it easier for the average person to take pictures. They could then develop their pictures themselves and print them with gaslight at night using this Velox paper. And it led to the development of and spread of amateur photography, some of these amateurs were members of clubs, and one of them was the Newark Camera Club, which actually started right around the same time as the Goodwin's invention, but before the first Kodak camera, which was the first to use roll film. But it was one of the biggest camera clubs in New Jersey, and a lot of the members were prominent, wealthy local people. Amateur photography also spread to women. There hadn't been a lot of women photographers, as I mentioned, but now that it was much easier to take pictures, many women began doing it, and Kodak started marketing their services to women. And just a couple of illustrations here. Also children, they started trying to get children to take pictures too, with the very simple cameras called brownie cameras. So let's look at a little closer at some of these photographers in Newark. Albert Speer started his career actually as a carpenter's apprentice in Newark. But he built a daguerreotype camera, since he was handy with wood, with which he made some of the first views of Newark. And there's another case where we haven't found any examples of this, but we have seen references to the fact that he did do it. And in 1842, he's listed in the Newark City Directory as a daguerreotypist, one of the first. He also invented a lot of interesting things, a cylindrical sounding board for pianos, combination lock and weather strip for windows, and what he called the endless traveling or railroad sidewalk, which I'm sure you've ridden one of these by now, and it was invented by Albert Speer in 1871. He tried to get New York City to adopt it, and they were not interested. Speer was moved to what became known as Passaic. At the time, it was Aquakanunk, and he got the post office to change the name to Passaic. He started what became the largest vineyard in New Jersey in 1859. That's my phone going off. Sorry about that. And he started Passaic's first newspaper, and he lived to a nice age of 87. George Cook is probably the best known 19th century New Jersey photographer, but he didn't do the work that he's known for in New Jersey, but I have to include him here. He lived from 1819 to 1902. He became an orphan early on in Connecticut, and he came to Newark and was brought up by his grandmother. And then he made his way to, as a teenager, he made his way to New Orleans, where he became a daguerreotypist in the early 1840s, and then returned to Newark, where he was active in 1845 and 46. After he married a young woman from Newark, he traveled south with her, and as they traveled, they would set up daguerreotype studios and then sell them to other photographers. And then later he would supply them with Daguerrean materials. So he became a dealer in photographic materials. And then eventually he settled in Charleston by around 1850. And he was there during the Civil War, and he became known as the Matthew Brady of the South. Even though he was in Charleston from the 1840s to 1880, during that period, he also traveled frequently and worked in other places. Here's 3 pictures of Cook at different stages of his life. And an example of one of his daguerreotypes from Charleston. Here's another one. This one he made while he was the camera operator at the Root Gallery. Marcus Aurelius Root and Samuel Root were brothers who had studios in New York and Philadelphia. And he was filling in for one of them who was ill in Philadelphia in 1856. He also was partners with Samuel M. Fassett in Chicago. He didn't go to Chicago himself too much, but he was a partner with Fassett. And Fassett made this excellent photograph of Abraham Lincoln in 1859. During the Civil War, Cook was asked by a Confederate general to document the shelling of Fort Sumter by the Yankees. He said, want to show the world what the Southerners can endure. And this picture is actually a reproduction of a painting that was made from 3 half stereo views by Cook during the bombardment. And that exploding shell that you see there, it was painted in. The exposures were too long to have recorded that. But you can see the fort was being reduced to rubble, and it was very dangerous for Cook to have been out there photographing. And he made quite a few pictures at that occasion. Here are a couple of CDVs, hand colored, that he did in the 1860s from Charleston. He later moved to Richmond, where his career continued until his retirement close to 1900. Now, Charlotte Prash is the first known woman photographer in New Jersey, and she had a studio in Newark from 1848 to 1853. She was born in Pennsylvania, and the family actually came to New York, and she lived in New York with her 2 of her brothers, Andrew and George, who both were daguerreotypists. George was mostly known as a camera manufacturer, but he also made daguerreotypes. And Andrew really focused on becoming a dealer in Daguerrean materials. George Prash came to Newark and actually worked for his sister for a couple of years, or at least about a year in 1849-50. And then he opened up his own studio in Newark relatively briefly. In 1853, Charlotte married Alfred Day, and then he became a daguerreotypist. And I'll show you a couple of other things about Charlotte. This is the 1846 New York City Directory, and you can see Andrew Prash listed as philosophical instruments, which is a euphemism for Daguerrean supplies. And I don't know who Charles Prash is, but Charlotte is listed there as a daguerreotypist in 1846. And then George saying he's making portraits taken in the best style at 179 Broadway, and his home is Harsimus, which is Jersey City today. Here's the 1850 business directory for the state of New Jersey for the section on Essex County. And it lists Miss C. Prash, they added a T for some reason, on Broad Street in Newark. And she was one of only 8 daguerreotypists listed in the whole state of New Jersey in this directory. Right under her is another one, Robert T. Price of Elizabethtown, which became Elizabeth. And he's the father of Frank Price, who I'm going to talk about a little later. I'll show you a few examples of Charlotte Prash's daguerreotypes. They're quite rare. It's been very hard to locate examples, but I'll show you what I've been able to find. If you're interested in more about Charlotte Prash, I wrote an article about her for the online journal Garden State Legacy, and if you search for that, you can locate it. More. Now, Charlotte left the Daguerrean business, and she became a baker for a while. This is an ad she placed in 1853. Mrs. Day, formerly C. Prash, Miss C. Prash, that she has returned to her old place, and she's offering her services. And she mentions that in addition to doing regular portraits, she also will take pictures and put them in frames and lockets and breast pins and bracelets. She then went with her husband to Paw Paw, Michigan, where one of her children was born. And while she was there, she made an ambrotype showing these storefronts. And then when she came back to Newark from Michigan, that's when her husband became a baker. And then she opened an ice cream shop in the bakery. This was in the late 1850s. Then they moved in the late 1860s, they moved to Rhode Island. By that time, she had 4 children. And they bought a bakery shop there. But it was right around the time of an economic depression, so that really didn't do very well. And they struggled on, though. And then they ended up living in Dartmouth, Massachusetts by 1880. Her son, George W. Day, who was probably named after Charlotte's brother, George Prash, became a photographer. And in 1890, he was working in Brooklyn, and Charlotte came in and lived with him for a while and probably was helping him in his photography business. She died in 1899. Here's the tombstone of Charlotte and her family, Alfred, her husband, and children, Mary and George W., the one who became the photographer, who died in 1921. We've already mentioned George, so to wrap up George, he was in Newark part of the time for about 10 years between 1846 and 1855. Later, he claimed that he may have made the first daguerreotype in the United States. He was asked by Samuel Bemis in New York, who was a doctor who wanted to make a daguerreotype after having read about it. He asked George to make him a camera. And George said that before he delivered the camera, or before it was picked up by the customer, he tried it out himself. He said it didn't come out too well, but that he took a picture before the guy who bought the camera did. So he thinks he may have taken the first daguerreotype in America in August of 1839. One of the things that he made was this mercury fuming box for daguerreotypes. I mentioned that that's how you develop the daguerreotype, was putting it, being exposed to mercury fumes. And this one he built, and it was used by Samuel Morse. And the two of them actually were partners in a daguerreotype studio in New York for a while. I showed you a couple of examples of carte de visites earlier by Orrin Benjamin. So I'd like to tell you a little bit more about him. He was from New York State, moved to New York when he was about 20, and moved to New Jersey when he was about 20. And he opened up his first gallery in 1851 in Millburn, then he was in Rahway, and then by 1853 he was in Newark, where he remained active until 1879. This is an example of a post-mortem daguerreotype by Benjamin from the 1850s. Post-mortem photographs were not that unusual back in that period. It was a time of high infant mortality. Very often a child would die before they had ever had a picture taken. So the parents would ask the photographer to come to the house in the parlor and make a daguerreotype. Later they would make paper prints, after the Daguerrean era was over. In 1855, Benjamin was the first known photographer to offer ambrotypes in New Jersey. That's just around the time when the process was introduced. Marcus Root in Philadelphia was probably the first in 1854. So this is really quite early. And then the following year, he said he was the first to introduce the paper prints from glass plate negatives in New Jersey. And he made a wide variety of different kinds of photographs. He advertised extensively. This is, he would have long ads in the Newark Daily Advertiser, for example. Here he says that in 1856, he's now got the new and beautiful style of picture making familiarly known as photography or likenesses on paper. So it's amazing to think about, paper photographs just being introduced, and that Benjamin was claiming to be the first or among the first to actually offer that as an option. In this ad, in October of 1856, he mentions that he took the diploma for the best ambrotypes and daguerreotypes at the state fair. And in fact, he won a lot of awards at these state fairs. He would submit work every year. He got the awards for best daguerreotypes in 1856 and 1860, the best plain photographs on paper in 1856, 57, 59, the best ambrotypes in 1857, and others. There's a long list. I'm not going to be able to tell you about all of them. He also liked to use poems in his ads. I won't show you one here. I'll just read you an example. Here's one from, this one is from 1855, when he said, "A chance is now offered which if missed is a sin. His pictures are matchless. I need say no more. His gallery is in Broad Street, number 274. And another one where he says, "I love the midnight hour, when care its flight is winging far, and hope beams out from every star in its beguiling power. I love the hour of the day when forms and faces that I love can go to Benjamin's and have their likenesses portrayed with all of nature's loveliness." So after a fire burned him out in 1865, Benjamin moved to a farm near Elmira. I didn't quite get up to there on the slides. Another thing he offered was halotypes, which were ambrotypes on glass with reverse painting. This is an example of what I think is a halotype by Benjamin. And here I mentioned that he was married, he had 3 kids. In 1865, his studio burned and he moves to near Elmira. He briefly operated a studio in Corning, and then he moved to Orange, New Jersey, where his son, Orrin Jr., began working with his father. He eventually took over the business. I'll show you some of, they switched to making photographs on carte de visites like other photographers in the 1860s, and they made cabinet cards. Now, this is a cabinet card which is called an ivoryette, which has a very light background, which was created using lighting effects. So Benjamin kind of came to a sad end. He had a fall from a wagon in 1886 or so, and he got typhoid fever. He started becoming mentally confused, and by 1894, he was certified insane. He was not the only photographer who had worked in the Daguerrean era to end up in an insane asylum. As you probably know, mercury can lead to mental problems. And there were several others who had similar problems who had worked in the Daguerrean era, possibly because of exposure to chemicals. And that's what Benjamin, in fact, said was his problems was caused by. He also claimed, to the amusement apparently of some of the people in the hospital, that he said he was the best photographer in the country. And I guess they didn't believe him. They thought that was an indication of his insanity, but he might have been telling the truth. Actually, his son ran the business until 1889, and Benjamin died at Essex Hospital for the Insane in 1895. He was only 65. Joseph Kirk was born in England in 1827. I showed you a chart earlier showing that he had the largest business in New Jersey in 1867. He actually had 12% of the gross for all the photographers in the state. He emigrated in 1854. He managed William Rolfe's gallery for about 8 years in Newark. And In 1862, he took rooms at the residence of Mrs. Sarah B. Huff, whose husband had deserted the family and gone to New Zealand. Kirk bought out the studio of J. Allen and Brother in July of 1863. And here is an early ad of his from 1865, indicating it's a full page ad in the Newark City Directory. And he mentions that he makes large solar pictures, which are large, they're enlargements using an enlarger that uses sunlight as the source. And the quality of those tended not to be good, so they were usually colored over with pastel or charcoal or watercolor. So Kirk, for the next 40 or so years, he had studios in Newark along Broad Street, and he did all kinds of work. He did not only portraits, but he also did outdoor work, landscapes, engineering drawings. I'll show you an example of one of his architectural pictures in a moment. This is an early carte de visite of his, where he mentions under his name successor to J. Allen and Brother. And this is a typical camera that he would have used. It has 4 lenses, so you could take 4 of these carte de visite negatives onto one glass plate, and then you print them all together, and then you'd cut up the paper and mount them individually on the cards. You could take the pictures one at a time, or you could take all 4 at a time. Here are 2 different carte de visites that were taken at the same moment. You can see they're extremely similar. Here's another one that's early, which says successor to J. Allen. And here's one from the period of the summer of 1864 to the summer of 1866, when photographers were taxed by the federal government and had to put a revenue stamp on the back of their photographs to show that they had paid the tax. So it was a 2-cent tax for work up to 25 cents. Beginning in 1865, if it was under 10 cents, there was a 1-cent tax. You put a 1-cent stamp on the back. Here's another one. This is a Civil War, from the Civil War period. Kirk photographed a number of Civil War soldiers. This is an unusual horizontal format in a Kirk carte de visite. So I mentioned that Kirk was living with Mrs. Huff, and she finally got a divorce after a few years. She'd been deserted for almost 15 years when she finally got the divorce. And her husband had gone to New Zealand, and she had 4 sons. And it seems very likely that the sons learned photography in Kirk's studio, because her oldest son, Ferdinand, became a photographer in Newark. And the other sons also became photographers, although they didn't have their own studios in Newark. Ferdinand was quite successful. He transferred a lot of land in Newark to his mother. This is a Newark Atlas in 1873, which shows entire blocks in South Newark that he transferred to his mother. On the left-hand side, you see Milford Park, which is now Schleifer Park. And on the right-hand side, you see Pennsylvania Avenue, which became railroad tracks. So that's the very southern part of the city. Here's some examples of Kirk's carte de visites with, notice the negative numbers, and they're useful for dating because there's a sequential number that he would put on his negatives for filing, so that if somebody wanted to reorder a picture, they could tell him what the number was. Kirk had an invention, the double-sided collodion negative, which meant that instead of just coating one side, he would do the standard coating on one side and then a very light coating of collodion, sensitized collodion on the other side. And he said it gave his prints a greater depth. I've looked at them. I got to tell you, they look good, but I couldn't tell you if one really was done with the double-sided method or not. But his son, Frank, who went and followed his father to New Zealand, his biological father to New Zealand, he advertised that he used the double-sided collodion method. Kirk's gallery in 1882 was 25 by 100 feet, and he said at that time that he had 40,000 negatives that he had taken in the past 12 years. This is the abstract from the 1880 Census Products of Industry, and it shows these photographers how much they invested in the business and how many people they employed at the peak time during the year, and the gross value of all their products for the year. And in 1880, Kirk, you can see he's actually ranks second among all the photographers in Newark in terms of volume of business. Although the leader in volume of business, Clark and Schneiber, they only invested $700 in the business, whereas Kirk invested $5,000. In the 1880 census, Kirk was in Newark, but his wife Sarah was actually found in a farm in Bethel, New York, where the Woodstock Festival would take place a century later. And Kirk eventually retires and goes there. I suspect that that was a summer residence, and that Kirk continued working in Newark, and he continued until 1897. In 1900, they were in Bethel along with 14 of the Huffs, including Sarah's son, Frank, who had brought his family back from New Zealand. I'll tell you a little bit about Frank in a moment. Here's some other examples of Kirk's work. This is an outdoor view of an inclined plane in the Morris Canal in Newark, cabinet card. Here's some later carte de visites by him. This is the carte rouge style is a style that involves a dark background with a figure brilliantly lit. So Ferdinand Huff, who is the stepson of Joseph Kirk, I mentioned he had three brothers, James, William, and Frank. Ferdinand was the oldest. And in 1867, after, I believe, working for Kirk and learning the business, he succeeded Edward Stoutenberg at a studio over Garangen's drugstore. And his brother William worked there in 1872, probably at other times as well. Here's an ad for Ferdinand in 1873, indicating that he does both indoor and outdoor work and in all different formats and sizes. And he's definitely looking for business. So Ferdinand married a woman named Emily. He had 2 children with her. She unfortunately died. And then he did marry again in 1884 and had a son named Ferdinand Huff Jr. For a while, in the late 1870s, he took a break from photography and he was partners in a saloon, restaurant, hotel. And part of it had Huff's Ladies Saloon was part of that establishment. But then he went back to photography after that. He did oil paintings from photographs as well as straight photographs. And he opened a branch studio in Asbury Park, operated by another Ferdinand Neuberger was his operator in Asbury. And right near the end of his career, he moved the studio to 839 Broad. Here's late 1860s. This is an early Ferdinand Huff carte de visite. And here's an 8x10 mounted oval photograph. Here's an outdoor view that's done as part of a series they did of houses designed by architects named Brigg and Coleman. There's about, I know of at least 6 different ones of this series. Another Huff. And cabinet cards beginning 1870s and then more popular in the 1880s, although he continued doing carte de visites like this one in the 1880s. So Huff dies in 1897, and a couple of years later, his widow, Ida, married Ferdinand Neuberger, the guy who had been running the studio in Asbury Park. Ferdinand was 26 and Mrs. Huff was 39 at the time. Neuberger continued the Huff studio in Newark until 1908. And by 1914, he became an auto dealer, probably a more lucrative profession at that point. Here's an example of a tintype from the Asbury Park studio. And this is a late Newark cabinet card from the Huff studio at the time that Neuberger had taken over. This was after Ferdinand Huff had died. There's a tintype from the Huff studio in Asbury Park, credited to Neuberger. So briefly, Frank Huff, the youngest son of the James Huff, who absconded to New Zealand. He follows his father to New Zealand. His father left when he was a baby, so he didn't even know his father at the time his father left. He was only a year old at the time. And he goes to Queenstown, where his father lived. He marries a local woman there named Priscilla. And then he opens up a photo studio there. And then he moves from time to time to other places in New Zealand, both on the North Island and on the South Island. This is a carte de visite of Frank Huff taken by Joseph Kirk when Frank was a little boy. And it's actually in New Zealand, this particular photo, at the Lakes District Museum. And here is Frank when he was a photographer in New Zealand. He has a very nice mustache. And a couple of examples of his carte de visites when he was a photographer in Wanganui. He also did outdoor work. This is the wreck of the Otago at Chasland's Mistake, which is this outcropping of rock that captured a number of ships that ran aground there. He and his wife Priscilla had 5 children. The first 4 were born in New Zealand, and then they came back after he went bankrupt. They came back to the United States. The 5th child was born in New York in 1892. And then he split his time between Newark and Bethel. He turns up at different times in one place or the other. For a while, he had a studio in Bethel that was at a hotel or by a hotel that was on the lake. And he died in 1928. Probably his death was accelerated by an auto accident that he'd had a couple of years earlier. Theodore Crane. Theodore Crane is descended from Jasper Crane, who was one of the early settlers in Newark. I'm sorry, Jasper didn't settle in Newark. Jasper settled in New Haven, where he was one of the first residents in New Haven. And then he came to Newark by 1667. And his great whatever, Theodore was a photographer in Newark by 1869. Crane is mostly known for his outdoor work, although he did do portraits as well. He had 6 children with his wife, Mary, and he also worked as a phonographic teacher, which meant that he taught shorthand in the 1880s and 1890s. Some of his work was done in the format of stereographic views, like this picture of St. Michael's. And here's the Dime Savings Bank in Newark in the 1870s. Here's a nice group shot of a fire company in the 1870s. Here's one of his portraits. This is a cameo CDV in which the photographer would put the carte de visite into a press that pushed out an oval forward a little bit, so it looked like a cameo. Gives it a little 3D effect. Here's a cabinet card of Bloomfield College when it was one building around 1880. And this is Robert Stoutenberg Jr.'s store. I mentioned Edward Stoutenberg was a photographer, and this was, I believe, his brother's store, inherited from his father, Robert Stoutenberg. Crane's first wife, Mary, died in the late 1800s, and he remarried a woman from Germany in 1898. And he began visiting Mount Tabor, the summer retreat for Methodists that's similar to, in concept, to Ocean Grove, and continued having his primary residence and business in Newark. But by 1910, in the census, he was listed as a resident of Mount Tabor, and he died there in 1919. So he did do some photography in Mount Tabor. But early Mount Tabor publications have photographs that are not credited, so it's hard to tell if he took them or somebody else took them. Okay, since we're running a little short on time here, I'm going to go rather quickly through some of the other photographers who lived in Newark and worked in Newark. George Bernard became a famous Civil War photographer, but he probably began his career in Newark in 1844. Here's an example of a stereo of a slave auction site in Atlanta, taken during the Civil War period, just after the Civil War. George Bedford operated in Newark from 1858 to 1867, when he relocated to Haverstraw, New York. Here's a carte de visite of a robot that he made in 1868. I don't know if this robot ever made it into production or not. And here's a cabinet card that he did from Haverstraw in the 1880s. Christopher Blake is an example of a photographer who didn't seem to make a real go of it. His father was a shoemaker. He grew up in Irvington, and he was in the Marines during the Civil War. He worked as a carriage maker and a carpenter. And then he opened a studio in 1873 on Broad Street, but I have not been able to find any examples so far. I would love to find one. And then he had an accident in 1874. He tried to shoot a stray cat and his gun exploded. He missed the cat. He also just missed a woman in the house next door. He had to have his left hand amputated. And a year later, he gave up the photography business and he became a watch salesman and later a grocer. He was married a couple of times, had children with both wives, and he died at the age of 56 of pneumonia and heart failure. Abraham Bogardus is a well-known photographer, mostly for his work in New York City, but he operated in Newark from 1849 to 1851. This is him. He was president of the National Photographic Association, the first president. This is an example of one of his daguerreotypes. And a cabinet card by him. Did very fine work. William Cohn lived his whole life in Newark, and at the time he died in 1966, he was the oldest active New Jersey photographer. He was 92 years old. One of his first commissions was to photograph the parks in Newark. And there's a large collection of his work at the New Jersey Historical Society. George Cox started out primarily as a outdoor photographer, born in Princeton. In the 1880s, he was a photographer for the Metropolitan Museum of Art, New York, and he had a studio in New York where he would do portraits. In 1897, he gave up the studio and went to his home in South Orange, where he made photographs from there. He presented himself as an artist and tried to get away from being labeled as a commercial photographer. He didn't advertise at all. He was known as a brilliant conversationalist, but his problem was drinking. And eventually he was admitted to the Trenton State Hospital with homicidal and suicidal delusions, and he died a year later. His archives are at the National Museum of American Art. He did terrific portraits. This is Henry Ward Beecher. And the author of that article, that Beecher photo, is Ida Tarbell, famous social reformer. That's her by Cox. Here's Walt Whitman by Cox. And this is one of the few photographs that he sold, but he sold it for Whitman's benefit, not for himself. George DeCamp also spent his whole life in Newark, Lake Cone. He was quite prolific between 1864 and 1893. He had a spinal problem, myelitis, for half his life, and he died in 1893 of exhaustion at the age of 50. But his work is frequently found. Matthias Fleming is another inventor who worked in Newark. He was from Belgium or Luxembourg. He came to the US in 1849 and moved to Newark in 1869 from New York. He made cameras, and he also was in the photo supplies business, which was later taken over by his son, Victor. Here's a patent that he made for to manipulate plates. I showed you earlier a camera with 4 lenses. If you wanted to move the plate behind the particular lens, this was an invention that would make that easier. So you could move the plate up and down or side to side using this invention. He also invented something that would make it easier to move the camera itself on the platform on top of the tripod. And that's what this patent was for. Henry Inslee was one of the first daguerreotypists in the US in 1840. And he was partnering with George Prash at that time. He operated on his own in Newark in 1843, and then in New York and in Jersey City. And he was married to Sarah Prash, who was the sister of Charlotte Prash and George Prash. And his son also became a photographer, Henry A. Inslee. Henry E. Inslee invented the illuminated daguerreotype, and this is an example of what one of those looks like. And here's a picture of the Inslee family. Inslee with his wife, and his son Henry A. is just to the right of Mrs. Inslee, and he's the one who became a photographer. The other son, Albert, became a painter. The Mattia brothers were sons of Angelo Mattia, who was known as Colombo because he was like Columbus. He was one of the first residents of Little Italy in Newark. The Little Italy section in Newark, as some of you may know, was in the First Ward. It's now called 7th Avenue District. It's not what it was, but he was one of the first residents in the area, and he was really later credited as really because he brought his family and then he invited his friends to come. He really helped develop that as an Italian neighborhood, and his sons. Petrino and Ruggieri, who became known as Peter and Richard, they became photographers, and they had their own gallery in the late 1880s and then again in the early 1900s. Here's Petrino Mattia painting a self-portrait of himself with his wife in 1887. And here's a cabinet card by the Mattia brothers from the late 1880s. This is another photo. It's a cabinet card, probably approximately cabinet card size, of Angelo Mattia, the son of Petrino Mattia. And here's the Ruggiero Mattia and family on a visit to Coney Island. I want to thank Rita Mattia for providing these illustrations, except for the cabinet card that I showed you earlier. Dr. William Mead was one of the first important amateurs in Newark. He was a member of the Amateur Photographic Exchange Club, which was the first amateur club in the US. They had 30 members and they would exchange 6 photographs a year. Here are a couple of stereo views showing Newark by Mead in the 1860s. Morris Saretzky was one of the first Russian Jewish photographers in Newark. He was friends with Morris Yog. I'll show you a little bit of Yog when we get to the Wise. He emigrated in 1891. And here Yog and Otetsky, or also known as Otetsky, they were partners about 1890. Here's one by Otetsky and Littauer. I don't know anything about Littauer. The musician looks like he might be African-American. Frank Price began and ended his career in Newark, but in the middle, he was in Elizabeth and New York. He was the son of Robert Price. I showed you that listing in the directory earlier in 1850. He began his career in Newark in 1863. Then he went to Elizabeth, then New York, where he was partners with Alfred S. Campbell of Elizabeth. And he returned to Newark in 1880, where he had the largest, or one of the largest galleries in the state with 3 floors, and he had 5 assistants there. Together with Campbell, he patented the ivory cameotype, which looks very much like a carte rousse, like I showed you earlier. Their device was something you inserted into the camera to make this effect easier, to get that dark background. Here's another cabinet card by Price. The current issue of New Jersey Studies has an article about Price that I wrote. Ludwig Schill is one of the many German photographers in Newark and Jersey City, those areas. He was born in 1857. He was a photographer when he came over here already. And he came a year after he got married. And he was active in Newark for about 15 or 16 years. Did a large volume of work. He was near the top 3, he had parts of the top 3 floors of a big building. I'll show you a picture in a moment of the US Credit System building on the corner of Market and Washington. And there was an elevator for that building. And then after his Newark period, he then had his home combined with a studio in West Orange from 1901 to at least 1924. Schill had a tragedy in 1899 when his 3-year-old daughter swallowed her mother's heart medicine and died. Here's from Essex County Illustrated in 1897, has a portrait of Schill. And then on the left-hand side, you can see this big building. And on the top, it's a little hard to see, sort of near the flag, there's big letters that says Schill right on the building there. A nice view of the interior of the studio showing the skylight and the large camera that would use for portraits. There's also a backdrop where you see a man standing and a backdrop behind him. And there's several large cameras in the picture. Just an example of Schill's cabinet cards. The Newark Public Library has many cabinet cards by Schill of men in their alphabetical file, filed by the person. Another German photographer, Helmuth Schumacher, born in Lübeck, Germany in 1856. He advertised that both German and Swedish were spoken in his gallery. And he also had a tragedy with his child. His only child died at 7 months old. He was treasurer of the Professional Photographers of New Jersey in 1911. So he was a well-respected guy, and he was active until at least 1941. So he had a long career. Many of these German photographers had excellent skills posing subjects. The quality of the work in Germany was very high in the late 19th century. And some of these photographers, when they came over here, they had training in art photography studios before they came over to the US. I mentioned Stoutenberg earlier as the son of the wealthy merchant, Robert Stoutenberg. He was a rich guy. He lived kind of a dissolute life. He was sort of a playboy. And he had various partners that he operated studios with. I don't know if he actually took any of the pictures himself. Then he had a big problem in 1880 when he was involved in a stolen diamond case, and he was sent to prison. He got sick in prison, I think with what we would call tuberculosis today. He got paroled because he was so ill. He went to Saratoga to try to recover his health, but he died at the age of 45. Here's a portrait of the governor of New Jersey, Marcus Ward, by Stoutenberg and Rose. Royal Hill Rose, after this partnership, he operated on his own in Newark briefly, but then he moved to Princeton, where he became the leading photographer in Princeton in the 19th century. Henry Thine was started his career in Chicago, and he got burned out in the Great Chicago Fire. There's a mistake here. It says Chicago Studios, 1874 to 21. That should say Newark Studios. I didn't catch that one. He got involved in local Republican politics, and he had a number of different positions in the city. He was then appointed New Jersey State Assemblyman, and then he became city photographer of Newark from 1920 until his death in 1938. Here's a picture of Thine when he was president of the Common Council in 1904. And an example of one of his cabinet cards. And another little later one. John Sherman started his career in Charles Parker's studio. Parker moved to Morristown. In the 1890s, Sherman managed Ferdinand Huff's gallery in Newark, and then he had his own galleries in Newark from 1899 to 1947. So his career extends well into the 20th century. And he also was respected by his peers. He was president of the Photographers Association of the Middle Atlantic States. He photographed some well-known people, including President McKinley, Buffalo Bill Cody. He was a photographer for the Newark Police Department. Somebody thought that he was the guy who invented the watch the birdie, telling kids to watch the birdie when he took their picture, but that really predates him. So that's not true. By 1930, he lived in Hillside, and that's where he died in 1952. Here's a nice example of a portrait by Sherman. J. Rennie Smith was from New Jersey. He was active for about 30 years in Newark, in the 60s to the 90s. And he had one of the largest businesses in Newark with 8 employees. He shot industrial.
Hey, Gary,
Yeah.
Excuse me, are there a lot more people? We were hoping to finish up by 8:30. It's almost 8:30 now.
We're
Are there a
getting
lot more photographers?
No, we're up to S and I'm going to Y. So
How many more are there?
maybe 3 or 4.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, we're
Just
getting
checking.
Yeah.
Okay.
Smith did both industrial photography and portraits, and he had a branch in Asbury Park, and he died in Newark in 1905. And Emil Spahn, he was another German photographer, born in 1836 or so, and he was in the Union Army in the United Turner Rifles, where he was captured, and then he was paroled and he came back. And then he operated galleries in Newark from 1866 to 85, but his financial fortunes declined, and he jumped off the railroad bridge in West Bergen and committed suicide. Spahn issued an album of original portraits tipped in, of prominent New Jersey people, including Thomas Edison, seen in this example. Edward Weston is no relation, as far as I know, to the famous California photographer by the same name. He was an honorary member of the Newark Camera Club, but he was mostly a manufacturer. He was founder of the Weston Electric Instrument Company, which made all sorts of instruments. But one of the things they made, which is very familiar to 20th century photographers, is the Weston light meter, which was actually invented by his son, Edward F. Weston, in 1932. And that's what the early Weston looked like. I used a Weston Master 5, that was like the 5th generation Weston meter in the 1970s, but this is an early one. And here we come to Morris Yag, who is Saretzky's partner. He was from Russia. Native language was Hebrew. He came to the US in 1885. He was naturalized on the same day as Morris Saretzky. And he had studios in Newark from 1890 to the 1930s, sometimes with partners. He died in 1939. And here are a couple of cabinet cards by Morris Yag. And finally, we get to, I got W and Y mixed up, but this is the last one. Another German photographer, Gustav Walters, who had studios on Broad Street between 1897 and the 1930s. And here's a very unusual subject, 2 Asian women in a cabinet card in 1897. So that's the end. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm sorry that, went a little long, but
Sorry about that. I just don't know. I just wanted to see how much time was left. We usually try to keep them to like an hour and a half or so.
Yeah, well, we just did an hour and a half right there.
Okay, there you go. All right, so we did have a couple of questions though. So let me just get to, there was a question and a comment. So first of all, somebody wants to know, how did you get interested in researching all of these photographers?
Well, I was teaching history of photography at Mercer County Community College, and I taught there for 34 years. And I started collecting old photographs to show my students. And I used to go to the flea market in Lambertville, and some of the pictures I got were by New Jersey photographers. So I started keeping track of them and looking for more examples, since I lived in New Jersey. And then I met Charles Cummings and John O'Connor, and they told me they had a list, so I got their list and I kept adding to it. So that's sort of how it all started. And at some point, I wrote an article that kind of was a survey of 19th century New Jersey photographers that was published in New Jersey History, and it's available on my webpage. So that was the first, big survey article that was done on the subject, and it had a list of a few hundred photographers at the end of the article. And then since then, I've been writing articles about specific photographers or groups of photographers. So there's one that's I mentioned the current issue of New Jersey Studies on Price. And the next issue will have one on John P. Doremus of Patterson.
Okay. And there's, you mentioned William Cohn in your presentation. Somebody left a comment here. There is a wonderful collection of 9,000 glass plate negatives of Newark photographer William Cohn at the New Jersey Historical Society. You mentioned this in your—
Yeah, I did. Yeah. And
there's a link here in the chat box to—
it's an amazing collection. Absolutely. I visited there and I saw them. Most of Cohn's work is 20th century, so I don't, focus too much on him as a 19th century photographer, although he did start, around 1890.
Okay. So what, and your website is GarySaretzky.com?
It's Saretzky.com.
Saretzky.com. So
it's on the slide right there.
Oh, okay. Oh, there. Oh, yeah. Oh, I didn't. Okay. I also typed it in the chat box. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Gary. This was really great. And it's an impressive amount of research that you put into that. That was really good. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you, everyone else, for coming here tonight and being part of our program. Good night, everyone. Be safe.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you all to who have attended. I appreciate your attendance. Thank you very much.
Okay. Good night.
Good night. Have a happy holiday.